Well, hello everyone, and today we are doing another class assignment, section 2, and today I'm doing it with my mom and my dad, and this is called the Norris Roundtable, and let us begin. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce my little sister, Katie. Okay, so will you please tell me about James Meredith?
In 1962,
James Meredith became the first African American student admitted to the segregated University of Mississippi. After the intervention of the federal government, an event that was a flashpoint in the civil rights movement.
Now, Meredith, he was inspired by President Kennedy's inaugural address, and he decided to exercise his constitutional rights and apply to the University of Mississippi. They didn't know that he was African American when they applied, so he actually got in. His goal was to put pressure on the Kennedy administration to force civil rights for African Americans. And also, later that same year, he was shot in a march against fear.
Okay, interesting. Can you please tell me about the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
the start date was July 2nd, 1964.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
It prohibits unequal application for the voter registration requirements and racial segregation of the schools, employment, and public accommodations. It was part of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States.
So, who is George Wallace?
In June 1963,
Okay. Nope. Under.
He was the 45th governor of Alabama. Under federal pressure, he was forced to end his literal blockade of the University of Alabama and allow the enrollment of African American students.
Now, he's best remembered for his staunch segregation and populist views. Wallace notoriously opposed desegregation and supported the policies of Jim Crow during the Civil Rights Movement, declaring in 1963 the inaugural address that he stood for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So, what is sit-ins?
the sit-in started on February 1st, 1960.
A sit-in or a sit-down is a form of direct action that involves one or more people occupying an area for a protest, often to promote political, social, or economic change. The protesters gather conspicuously in a space or a building, refusing to move unless their demands are met.
Now, the sit-ins, they were started, like she said, in February 1960 when 4 black students from North Carolina A&T sat down at a Woolworth's lunch, A&T, excuse me, not AT&T, sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. What would happen was they would get arrested and then more people would take their spots, and those were kind of sit-ins. They just wanted to get many people in jail as possible.
Okay. What were the Freedom Riders?
From 1960 to 1968. Wait, no? Yeah? Okay.
Freedom Riders.
With the nonviolent protests.
Oh, okay. We're at the nonviolent protests.
The sit-ins were a form of nonviolent protest. They weren't meant to be violent, and they weren't. They actually practiced being yelled at and screamed at.
Okay.
The SNCC.
The National Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. There was a committee that sought to coordinate and assist direct action challenges to the civic segregation and political execution of African Americans. And this was done from, when was the dates?
1960 to 1968.
1960 to 68 was this organization.
So now, tell me about the Freedom Riders.
The Freedom Riders challenged this status quo by riding interstate buses in the South in mixed racial groups to challenge local laws or customs that enforce segregation in seating. The freedom rides and the violent reactions they provoked bolstered the credibility of the American civil rights movement.
Now, they called national attention to the disregard of the federal law and the local violence used to enforce segregation in the United States. Police arrested riders for trespassing, unlawful assembly, violating state and local Jim Crow laws, and other alleged offenses. But often, they first met white mobs attacked them without intervention.
What about the 1963 March on Washington?
It was Wednesday, August 28th, 1963.
The march was organized by Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who built an alliance of civil rights, labor, and religious organizations that came together under the banner of jobs and freedom.
Estimates of the number of participants varied between 200 and 300,000, but most widely cited estimates, somewhere around 250,000 people. Observers estimated that 75 to 80% of the marchers were black. The march was one of the largest political rallies of human rights in the U.S. history. It's also credited for helping pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Who or what was Sheriff Bull Connor?
Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, of 1897 to 1973, was a successful Alabama politician who held a variety of public offices for over 4 decades. Among them, Birmingham, Alabama's Commissioner of Public Safety.
Now, Connor, he was a staunch white supremacist. He was at the center of the white efforts to impede the work of social rights movement in Birmingham. He ordered the use of fire hoses and attack dogs to immerse the marchers, eventually incarcerating over 3,000 demonstrators. These brutal attacks helped focus national attention on the civil rights movement. It was these attacks, the ones they were done against children, and it was actually on television, so other people actually got to see it. Now, as for the last one, would be Asa Philip Randolph. As we mentioned before, he helped direct the March on Washington. He helped end employment discrimination, and in the defense industry and the National Civil Disobedience Campaign to ban segregation in the armed forces. The nonviolent protests and mass action effort inspired the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. So he was a main player in the civil rights movement. Thank you, and this would conclude our second and final roundtable. Thank you.